Hi, folks. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most venerated, mysterious, and controversial figures in human history, Jesus Christ. Here, today, on Big Pretty Man. Hi, and welcome back to Big Pretty Man, the channel for the extra large man who wants to live his life large and in charge. I'm your host, Timothy Big Pretty Crow, a wardrobe and lifestyle consultant for the extra large man. And today, folks, as I said, we're going to be talking about Jesus Christ. You know, on a planet of 7 billion people, 2 billion of those people not only believe in Jesus Christ, but they worship him as God himself. It's very impressive. But at the same time, it also brings up a lot of mystery and even controversy. And the reason being is that we really don't know that much about him. One of the most famous people to ever exist on this planet, and we know practically nothing about him. And that has left a pretty large hole that people have filled in. And sometimes they fill it in with good things, and sometimes not so good things. So when we consider that the idea of Christian nationalism is now in the news, I thought that it was kind of important that I went over the historic Jesus as best we can know, because as I said, we don't know a lot about him, and in fact, some people have even doubted that he existed at all. That he's a conglomeration of different cults and different myths and resurrection myths that have all been kind of squeezed together to create this what they would say was a fictional character because we have very little evidence of his birth, or I mean of his existence, and what is written down come much later, at least 50 years, 50 to 120 years later. So we don't have an eyewitness account of Jesus. So many people, as I said, have ruled him they didn't exist. So and then we get into the other arguments about Jesus. You know, what ethnicity was his, which I find that one's a little silly. But what color, what race was he? And that one has actually become a very touchy subject. Was throughout history he's been showed as this blue-eyed, blonde-haired, long-bearded figure in the long gracious robes and even with a purple mantle over the top. And that's the image of most of us have of Jesus. But a lot of that has offended a lot of other races, like African Americans, who say that it causes us to worship a white God. And that's been an issue. And they're trying to say that he was African, and the people firing back about that. And just that's also then it comes down to he's become the conservative Christian movement, which they try to justify whatever they do by the name of Jesus. So I think an examination of Jesus, both historically, is very important, and especially in this time. So we can go over, did he exist? We can go over his appearance. We can go over what he taught, and maybe come to some sort of realistic conclusion. Now, first, let's get started on this whole, did he exist? Is he real? Is Jesus real, or was he some sort of fictional character? And there are a lot of arguments. If you go on YouTube, you'll find a lot of arguments that say, oh, he's a combination of the of the Osiris cult, worked in with Greco-Roman philosophy, yeah, and their mystery cults, and all of that. And I'm very familiar with this argument, and I can tell you now that it's kind of viewed scholarly wise in the same way that flat Earth people are viewed. It's kind of pseudo science, and it's kind of seen as a bit ridiculous. And as far as now, one thing they are correct on is there is no historic material coming straight from Jesus. We don't have a single thing that he has written or said in his handwriting, signed by Jesus. Nothing with a byline, and we also don't have anything written about him contemporary or anyone that was really alive when he was alive that gives witness and verification of his existence. But then what you got to understand, folks, you can say that about most people in history. History really wasn't made for a person like Jesus, a person who was basically a poor uh, a poor farmer, or actually a poor worker without land, living in Palestine in the early first century. History records things about kings, about battles, about civilizations that were built up. Not about the poor, not about the farmers, not about the peasantry, the lower classes, not about the trade workers. Those people have lived by the billions on Earth since life began, and you don't hear anything about them. Most of them end up getting buried, and they and never to be known of again. And Jesus would have been one of these people. And it is not surprising that nothing was written about him during his lifetime. Uh, and it was only after his movement began to build up steam and started to build up numbers that suddenly it became something worthy of historians to say, hey, well, what's this? Who's this guy? And that really takes place. The first person to actually mention Jesus um, in a historical sense is Josephus, uh, who who, uh, who talked about him in his books about 93 to 94 A.D. Now Jesus is believed to have died about 33 A.D. So we're talking about 60 years later. Josephus would not have known Christ. What he knew of was people talking about him in that 50 years or 60 years, and he also talked about John the Baptist. Uh, and then of course the next person who actually adds a little more credit to the existence of Jesus is Tacitus, the Roman, and the Roman historian, and he in his annals he mentions Jesus and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. And the thing is that, and this would have been written about 116 A.D. So quite a while after the passing of Christ. Uh, but the reason that his information becomes so important is because it was something negative. He was speaking negative of Christianity and of Jesus. And if it was something made up, if it was something make believe, he definitely would have said something about it. He would have said, "Oh, this guy never existed. It's all made up. It all comes from this or that." No, he didn't. He just criticized Christ. So actually, his being negative about Christ kind of actually proves that Christ exists. Because if he didn't, he would have brought it up. So, but like I said, you could do the same. People say, well, you still don't have any proof that he exists. There's no proof that there's a single thing out there that proves he exists. You know what? They didn't, you got to understand the time. They didn't take birth certificates. They didn't there was no christening, obviously. And if nobody got a social security number or a photo ID. You were born and you died, you lived and you died, and only the people around you would have known you if you weren't do something of that was big on a historic basis. So if we took all of like even in the modern day, if we took everything away from you, if we took away your driver's license, if we took away your social security card, your ID, took all of that away, what proof would you have that you existed without a birth certificate and driver's license and ID and photos? What would prove you existed if you didn't have those things like they didn't? Nothing. In fact, you could say that of any historical figure, even the famous ones. For instance, um, say Genghis Khan. There's no there's no interview with Genghis Khan. There's no picture of Genghis Khan. All we have is people writing years later about Genghis Khan. And so how do we know Genghis Khan existed? How do we know that Shakespeare existed? Except well, he has a grave, but who knows who's in there? So you can really nullify any evidence you would throw out there about the existence of Jesus or anyone. And, you can give that argument about anything, anyone in history, but it really doesn't say they didn't exist. But there is one more closer to contemporary source we have about Jesus, and which supports his existence, and that is the letters of Paul in the Bible. Now, the letters of Paul, as I explained in my earlier video about Episcopalianism, about the Episcopal Church, Paul did not write these letters to be scripture. That was not his intention. He did not have an agenda for propaganda with these letters. These were letters to be sent to the community. It's just they were read so often and so much inspiration was brought out of them that when they started to do a collection of books to go in the Bible in 367, that these letters made it in. And if Paul had known, I'm sure Paul would be horrified to know his letters went into the Bible as scripture, because he would have fixed a lot of things. He wouldn't have contradicted himself so much. But because of that one way blind um, origin of the letters, it does offer some authenticity, because you got to understand, Paul never knew Christ, and the earliest letter was written about 25 years after the death of Christ. So he didn't know Christ. He never met Christ, except for on his vision on the road to Damascus. So but people he did meet and he wrote about meeting were people that did know Christ, his disciples. He met with Peter, one of his top disciples. He met with John. He met with James, a man who was said to be the brother of Christ and who said was actually in charge of the Jerusalem church at the time. He actually had to go to him to get permission to baptize these Gentiles and get the ruling on that, which he said, you don't have to be circumcised. So, so, and the thing is, these were the men that had known Jesus intimately, had ate with him, slept with him, and Paul is meeting with them. He's talking with them. They visit and they visit him in the Bible and the early Christians. So if these men are we trying to say that they all got together and made up this man? That kind of defeats the whole idea of an evolved figure out of different types of resurrection gods and mythology. Suddenly suddenly these Paul and James, and then of course Peter and James and these other disciples of Christ just suddenly pop up. That gives strong evidence that there was a Jesus. In fact, the strongest evidence I know, and just 20 years after his passing. So I think that when we're talking about whether the man existed, we can't be looking for a signed birth certificate. We have to be looking at the people that were around him, the people that knew him, people who give witness that he existed to his teachings. And the letters of Paul do that through the disciples that he associated with. This gives strong indication that Jesus was a very real man. Okay, so now that we've established that Jesus was a real person, what do we know about him? Well, unfortunately, very little. We nothing was written down about him until, like I said, about 50 to 90 years ago. 90 years later, after his passing. So, as far as anything about his personality, we know very little. um, as far as anything about how he looked. There was no indication. So what can we extract and know about the historic Jesus? Well, a few things. That if you look at the history, if you look at his ethnicity, if you look at his teachings, if you through a historic filter, we can learn quite a bit. Now, the first thing that I'm going to go over is his name, Jesus. Well, that wasn't his name. um, his name actually was Yeshua or Yeshushua. Basically the name Joshua. And I know saying Josh Christ sounds very odd, but the reason that the name changed is when it went from the Hebrew or Aramaic into Greek, it changed from Yeshua into Jesus. That because Greek really didn't have the grammar and and the letters to express Yeshua or Yeshushua. So they went with the closest they could get phonetically to Iesis or Iesis. And in fact, if you look at INRI, you still see that on the top of crucifixes, that stands for Iesis. Let's see, how does it go? Iesis Nazaria uh, uh, Rex Juden, which means Jesus Christ, King of the Jew, or Jesus, King of the Jews. So, and I'm sorry if I really butchered that up, but but it went from there. In fact, you heard the name Jesus. Well, that comes from the Latin, which also carried over into Latino languages. That's the reason you meet people named Jesus. You meet someone named Jesus, their name is Jesus. Um, and also in Arabic, they still call him Isa, which comes from directly from Isis or Iusus. So, and then of course when it gets into English and actually in German and into the English language, it becomes Jesus. So that's where we get the name Jesus. But if you'd have walked up to him and said, "Hey Jesus," he'd be like, "Who are you talking to?" My name's Josh. But so that we are kind of messed up on the history of someone. We don't even get his name right. So the next thing that we would talk about, it would be, and this is a controversial subject, and that would be the ethnicity and the race of Jesus. Well, as far as ethnicity, he was obviously Jewish. Both the Gospel of Matthew and Mark both make this very clear. Actually, all four of the Gospels. Um, but even more than that, he was living in Israel, actually in the northern part of Israel, in Galilee, which is a very and he was circumcised. We have that from Matthew. He read in the synagogue. This and also in Matthew they give this entire list of his genealogy from King David. It said that his father Joseph, or I guess it'd be his stepfather. We'll get into that later. Um, was descended from King David. So Jesus, yes, was Jewish. He was a Jewish man, and he was speaking of the Jewish religion. In fact, Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism um, later on, until it finally, in about the second century, broke completely away from Judaism, developed them into its own religion. So the ethnic identity of Jesus is very apparent. He was Jewish. Um, Now, as far as his race, this is where we get into some controversy in the world. And now one thing I'll say is that there is no description of what Jesus looked like in the Bible. Now, I know what you're going to say. Wait a minute. What about The whole thing about Jesus had feet that were feet like brass, and hair like wool, um, and red eyes, indicating that he could be African. Um, well, here's the thing. Number one, that is in the Bible, but it comes from Revelations, and Revelations was written by uh, around about 95 AD, was best we can tell, by a man named John of Patmos. Now, we don't know exactly who John of Patmos was. So now, within the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, they maintain that this is John the Apostle, the beloved apostle of Christ. However, that is the religious side of the view. From academic view, it's not seen as likely. For one thing, the being as John the Apostle is believed to have been born about 6 A.D., this would have made this man um, over 100 years old. And being as most people didn't live much past their 40s to 60s back then, that seems very unlikely. Also, the book of Revelation, the book of the Apocalypse, um, was written in Conic Greek, a very rough form of Conic Greek, but in Conic Greek, and it seems very unlikely that John the Apostle knew Greek to the point that he could write it. So what it looks like is that John of Patmos was a Greek Christian, and he lived during the time of persecution under Domitian, and lived through Nero. And he's having this vision of Christ being risen, Christ in his godlike form, and that's where we get the description, not an eyewitness description of what he looked like, but even in the text. And where this comes from is in first Revelations, verses 14 and 15, and in it says it does not say even there that he had hair of wool or hair like wool. That's not what it says. Don't believe me? Look it up. It says his hair was white as wool, white as snow. Not like wool, white as wool. So his hair was white as wool, not woolly. So that knocks that one out. And then the other one is his feet glowed like brass in a furnace. Not like brass, but brass in a furnace. Now, if you've ever seen brass in a furnace, it does not appear brass colored. It appears bright reddish gold. And also that his eyes burned with they weren't red like flames, they burned with like embers of flames. So and then we should look at the next passage there, and it says that a sword was coming out of his mouth, and he had stars in his hands. So what he is picturing, if you picture, he's this golden glowing God with red glowing eyes, and he's carrying these emblems, one out of his mouth and stars in his hands. If you ever looked at Greek statuary from the temples, you're going to see what they're talking about, because they were always made of brass or bronze, and in each hand they would hold these strange symbols, or symbols, an eagle or another god, something like that. So what he's picturing is Jesus with his white hair, glowing. Think of an Oscar with glowing red eyes and white hair, and you pretty much get close to what he's seeing. So he's seeing him in his divine nature. It's not saying that no description of a real person. He's not saying that his feet were like bronze and that he had woolly hair. That's a human description. This is what he's describing is not human. It's a vision of a powerful God from a Greek person going from a Greek mentality. So but as far as a description of Jesus in his life, we don't have one. So now, So there, it does beg the question: what did Jesus look like? Now, at the same time, throughout history, as I said earlier, Jesus is shown as having blonde hair and blue eyes and very Caucasian skin. So he looks, he's purely Caucasian, purely Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian. He's the ultimate looking white dude. And of course, the real Jesus would not have looked like this. Uh, that and some people have tried to bring it up as that making Jesus white and blue-eyed, blonde-haired was some sort of conspiracy to make him appear white. And we see this in Malcolm X and in other movie and other people talking about it, that it's trying to get other races to worship the white man. Now, I'm hence the controversy here. Now, I'm not going to say that some of that isn't true. I mean, it very well could be, but the depiction of Christ throughout history there has been depictions of Christ from long in the past as being a black man. Um, if you look at him from Ethiopia, he's a black man. But then if you look at him from pictures of him from Mexico or Spain, he appears to be Spanish. Or and in fact, um, I've seen the white Jesus, the black Jesus. I've seen the Asian Jesus, and he appears to be Asian. Uh, so, and the thing, and another thing is if you take another figure, and that would be Buddha, which Buddhism has never had a huge rise in the West. So he kind of outside of that supposed conspiracy. But let's look at Buddha, who lived 500 years before Christ, and if you see images of Buddha. Now, first about Buddha, Buddha was from Kapilavatthu, a small kingdom which today is in the edge of Nepal. So today he would look Nepalese or Indian. However, as the religion spread throughout China and Japan and Korea, most of the Buddhas I see look Japanese, Chinese, and very few even look like the Indian. So, and there is no conspiracy here. Here's the facts, folks. Now, I don't know if the whole conspiracy thing about trying to get black people to worship a white god and all of that is true, but I do know this. And the pictures of Buddha um, and his different ethnic and racial signatures, as well as with Christ, people tend to want to see God in their own image, to see those they venerate look like them. I think it's a subconscious thing. Um, but so when you go to Ethiopia, Jesus is black. When you go to Spain, he looks Spanish. So when you go to some Anglo-Saxon church, he's in the West, he's going to look white. People picture Christ, whom they see as God, in their own image. So I don't, and as far as any conspiracy, I'm not really seeing it. I'm not saying that it's not there, but I'm not really seeing it. I don't think that I'm not a big person on conspiracies anyway, and this one seems a little too big and a little too far-fetched. So therefore it comes down to, what did Jesus actually look like? Is there any depictions out there that really look like Jesus? Not really. um, what we know about Jesus is that he, as I said, he was a Palestinian he was a Jewish person from northern Israel, which is in present-day Palestine, and he would have looked very much like he would have had a Semitic look. He would have been had a Jewish look. Now, so it comes down to, what did Jews look like in the first century? Well, we do have a lot of depictions of, not of Jesus, but of his contemporaries, especially from like Egypt in the coffin portraits, as well as in some of the artwork and some of the artwork that came during that period. And we can kind of get also the skulls of the people that were contemporary. In fact, um, what we can tell from the skulls and the art was that one, as far as his face, he would have been his face would have probably been much more boxy than European. He was not European. He was not Indo-European. He was Jewish. So and Jewish skulls from that time appear to be much more thick, much more boxy, flatter cheeks, larger nose. Um, whereas if you look at the European skulls of the time, they're much more gentler angles. So that tells us a lot about why Christ would appear. In fact, they found a first century skull from Galilee that they did the reconstruction over. In fact, I see it a lot. People saying this was Jesus. That isn't Jesus, but he would have had, like, you can look out and say that person's Chinese, that person's Puerto Rican, or you can identify people. There are certain ethnic traits that come out, and this man didn't know Jesus, but he may have actually passed Jesus on the street or heard him preach, and he would have definitely there would have been an ethnic resemblance, certain features that they would have shared, and I think that this picture here kind of shows the real face of what Jesus would have looked like. Much firmer, stern features, a larger nose. His hair would have been dark and thick, dark, probably almost definitely black. His eyes would have been a very dark brown, probably dark to the point of they almost look black. Um, and his skin color, like most at the time, would have been originally been kind of an olive tint, kind of a lightish brownish tint, as they say, wheatish brown. um, and and plus as he did work out in the sun, it would have gotten darker. So he would have been a fairly dark looking individual. In fact, you would find this face, the same face, the same trait throughout the Middle East. Throughout he looked Middle Eastern, and you'd find this through in places like Northern Africa. You'd find it in places like Syria, in Jordan. You would find the faces that match with this one. So that's what Jesus really looked like. As far as his height, he was about 5 foot, between 5'4" and 5'6". People weren't that tall back then. We've actually grown much taller over the over the last couple centuries. So if you want to picture what he looked like, he probably had short hair that was very very curly. He would have had a beard, not as long as the normal Jesus beard we always see, but probably cropped short. Um, he would have had dark eyes. He would have had a fairly large, probably aquiline nose, meaning it's kind of hooked. And he would have had a dark, probably very, very leathery skin. Now, as far as what he wore, that becomes another issue. Um, he, uh, he, this is during the Hellenistic time period. After Alexander the Great brought conquered the world, he brought Greek culture to the world. So because he felt that the Greeks were superior, that they did things better, and that he brought Greek culture and Greek language. He brought Greek architecture, and he brought Greek dress to the world. And here in the Roman period, we're still in the Hellenistic period, and there's still that influence. So that would have influenced several things about Jesus. Number one, it would have influenced the way that he spoke. He would have Jesus did not speak Hebrew. Hebrew at that point had already become not a dead language, but more of a ceremonial language. It's used in the synagogues. But he would have spoke Aramaic. Um, and Aramaic comes out of Hebrew. It's very similar to Arabic, and Hebrew, obviously. But he also would have likely have spoken some Conic Greek. And the reason for that was it was the Hellenistic age. So the man, and he would have had to interact with a lot of other people from other places, and kind of like English is now, where you can find English just about anywhere in the world. That's the way Greek was at the time. It's kind of the universal speak, and he probably wasn't fully fluent, but he probably had a proficient level of speaking in Greek. Plus, he lived near Sepphoris, which was a Roman town, a Greco-Roman town, and within just a few miles from his home. And there's very little doubt that he went there to get some work, and he would have interacted with a lot of different people from a lot of different places. You've got to understand that at the time the Roman Empire brought people from all over the world. So there have been a lot of language spoke, but everybody would have known some Greek so they could communicate. Well, Jesus would have been the same. To communicate, he would have had to know some Greek. Which working thing is another issue with Jesus. Now it says in the Bible that he was a carpenter. His father was a carpenter and trained him to be a carpenter. Well, that's not quite accurate. Um, the word that they're using in the Greek that they're translating as carpenter is tekton. And a tekton is technically not a carpenter. It basically means a person that works with their hands, kind of a handyman type of thing. So, and actually, carpentry at the time would not have been a big business. There's not a lot of wood in that part of the world, and most things are made out of stone. So, um, most likely, um, his father Joseph, as well as Jesus, they probably did whatever work needed to be done. Probably worked more with stone than they did with wood, and they would have been the type that had been on building projects. They'd have been in on fixing things, fixing dams and roads, and and also any masonry. That would have been the type of world that they lived in. And actually, it would have been a very much a lower level living, because um, people that were farmers would have been better off because they owned or they had the rights to work land. These are landless people, doing what handy work they can be hired to do, which made it much more of a hand to mouth, indigent type of lifestyle. So we're talking about Jesus came. We learn from that name that he was a tekton, a basic labor worker who would do whatever needed to be done. Um, he came from one of the poorer classes of people, and I think that he talked about the poor a lot. Blessed are the poor. Um, he understood the plight of the poor because he came from the poor. I think that's very significant and very obvious. Now, back on Jesus's appearance. Um, as we've now discerned, is that he was a man about 5'4" to 5'6", fairly short by today's standards. He had dark curly hair, most likely a very dark color, dark black, a short beard. He would have had olive complected skin naturally, kind of a mocha color, that would probably get darker and more leathery as he worked in the hot sun. Which brings up another thing, the Shroud of Turin. There's a lot of evidence that the Shroud of Turin from carbon dating is a medieval forgery. But even more than that is its height. The height of the man on the shroud is 6 feet tall. If Jesus had been 6 feet tall, it would have been mentioned in the Bible. For one thing, he would have stood a good 4 to 5 inches. He'd been a giant in Israel at the time. He'd have been more like Goliath. So when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and and Judas had told the men, "Take the man that I kiss." Well, he wouldn't have had to tell him that. He'd say, "Take that big 6 foot dude over there." Take the giant dude among the little guys. So trying to say Jesus was 6 foot tall, that's unreasonable. But now back on way he dressed. Now, as I said, he came from the Hellenistic world, and Hellenistic dress had really kind of dominated the area. Now, one thing they get wrong in another thing they get wrong with showing pictures of Jesus is him in these long flowing robes, with a mantle with a purple mantle over it, and it's usually white flowing robe with a purple mantle. Forget that, because number one, the color purple. At the time, there was no such thing as synthetic colors. They come from natural dyes, and one of the most expensive dyes in the world was purple. It came from a shellfish, a small shellfish, and actually the Phoenicians were the great exporters of the color purple, and they made a fortune. They made a kingdom out of it. In fact, that's the reason purple was the royal color, because only the royalty could afford to be in purple. Purple actually wasn't made synthetic until the 19th century, and everybody went purple crazy. But in Christ's time, no, he would not have been wearing a purple mantle. Um, and even the white, a pure form of white, is not likely. Um, but what Christ did wear, and plus it was flowing down to his feet. Now, as I said, that's wrong as well. Now, what and during the time of Christ, the tunics that people wore, ones that were long into the feet, were for the very wealthy, and they were demonstrating that they didn't have to work, because it was, because you can't really do a lot of physical work in a long road down to your feet. So the no, what he would have worn would have been a shorter tunic that came just past his knees. We have depictions of that. In fact, this image here of an early image of Christ shows him wearing just such a tunic, and the tunic would have probably been made of two different materials. One being almost definitely would have been linen, um, because linen it's very hot there, and linen helps keep the body cool. Um, that would have been worn as an undergarment, and the upper garment would have either been another suit of linen, a tunic of linen, or it would have been of wool. And and as these robes at the time were dye was expensive, they probably were undyed. So they probably had the natural kind of mildew, wheatish color to them. And as for he did likely, we know from the scriptures that it says the lady that will reach for the hem of his cloak, that's the mantle he was wearing. Um, yeah, that it was probably an ochre color. Um, so so that's and as far as his feet, he wore sandals, just like everyone else. So very simple outfit, and he would not have worn a rich man's robes. So this is the image we get of Christ, very different from the iconic figures we see in churches or iconography. We have a short man, dark complected, leathery skin, with dark eyes, a large nose, a boxy face, probably large dark brown eyes, and a kind of a dark thick uh, hair. And he no, wasn't he actually looked like everyone else. So because he had to be kissed to be identified. So there was nothing about him that stood out from in a crowd. So these images, if he'd have been a 6 foot, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, um, white man, I think that he would have stood out. That's more the historical Jesus. Okay, now that we've got what the real Jesus would have looked like, let's try to establish exactly what did he teach. And the scary thing is, despite the Gospels in the New Testament, despite the letters of Paul, despite all of this, we actually really have no idea about what he said. Flat and simple, we have no idea, because the nothing, as I said, because he wasn't a big deal at the time. He was just a teacher out in the world, and that's something we can talk about is how the culture would have treated him. It's very apparent that Jesus would have been a street preacher. He got out, he would yell, "Listen," to people. He would talk about him going from town to town, going to when there was synagogues and preaching and talking. He was a street preacher, very similar to the ones you see out there today. When think about that, the next time you walk by the guy that's raving about raving about the Bible, Jesus would have been one of these, and his popularity was passed on. His teachings would have been passed by oral traditions that went back to his time. People say he said this and he said that, and it was eventually, finally written down. And when it comes to the Gospels, but now the earliest Gospel is the Gospel of Mark, and Mark was written about 50 to 60 years after Christ, and but the thing is, each one of these gospels has a agenda to it. And for instance, out of the four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Mark, which is much more primitive. They were all written in Greek, by the way. Um, Mark is much more primitive. He basically is telling Jesus as a magic man, as a miracle man. Um, Whereas Matthew, who we don't know who Matthew was, in fact, we don't know who any of them was because it says the gospel according to Matthew, gospel according to Mark, those titles were added later. We actually don't know who wrote them, except for perhaps Luke. Luke may have very well written his gospels, um, but but anyway, and Matthew, whoever he was apparently was Jewish at the time, because in his book he is comparing Jesus' story to the story of Moses. Whereas Moses fled from Egypt, Jesus went to Egypt. So, and his heritage going back, he set out his heritage going back to King David. He was describing a and his matching his life with that of Moses. He was describing a Messiah. He is trying to show the Jewish people this is the Messiah we've been waiting for. Uh, Now with Luke, Luke Luke seems to have been. It says he was a physician, and he definitely does not seem to be Jewish. In fact, he's most likely Greek. In fact, he was one of the followers of Paul. So in his gospel, he's kind of trying to more relate him to the Greek world. So whereas John, which was written much later, um, he was written by a very obvious Greek who had a good command of the language. It is the most, and as it's been a longer period of time, a more sophisticated theology had developed. So so you find a lot of Greek philosophy, even in the beginning. And there was the Word, and the Word was with God. That's comes straight from the Greek. So you get he turns Jesus more into a high philosopher. So each one of these gospels written for different times portrays Jesus in a different light. So they can't really be trusted. And most likely, the men that wrote these did not know Jesus. They were writing down stories that had been passed down through the years orally, sayings that he had said, and also then you get into the controversy of the synoptic gospels, which is the three gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and it shows that there was another source that they used. We know that Luke and Matthew had used Mark's gospel because we find exact sentences in there copied each time. I mean, exact to the word. So we know and we know that Mark came first. So we know that Luke and Matthew had Mark, and that they copied what he said into the Gospels. However, there are gospels that match word for word in Matthew and Luke, but that are not in Mark. Now that tells us only one thing, that they had another source, and they've started to call it the Q gospel, and Q coming from the German meaning mystery. Um, there's this mysterious text which has never been found, that apparently, according to most historians, was more of not really a narrative like the Gospels, but was more a list of proverbs from Christ, things that quotes that he said, and um, and that has never been found. When they found the book of Thomas and with the Gnostic text from 200 AD, they actually found a book that had that book has a basic quotes of Christ. So this book that came earlier probably had been compiled from the things that people had heard Jesus say, and are probably to closer to being authentic, but it's long lost. So, and then of course you have the books of Paul, who did not know Christ. In fact, he only crossed once. So we really have no idea what Christ taught. But before you go off on me here, bear in mind that if you do look at the like sayings in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, if you line them all up and you find the text that match in all four, and you put those together, you get a little closer to probably what he was teaching. And what comes out is that Jesus was a revolutionary, that he believed in less of a legalistic God, as he believed in a more fatherly God, the Abba theory, that God was your father. He wasn't a king that ruled over you. He was your father, and your father loves you. If he has to give you, he gives you rules. He will. If he breaks them, he has to punish you, but he does it out of love. And and at the time, that was revolutionary, or sort of. there are texts in the Jewish and the Jewish religion that talk about the same thing, but Jesus really emphasized them. That, and the story of the prodigal son really defines his ideal of what God was. So the idea of the golden rule uh, that he gave, do unto others as you have them do unto you. He said, that was asked of him, and this appears in all four of the Gospels, is that people ask him, what is the greatest law, or ask him, what is the greatest law, and he said to love thy God with all thy heart, all thy might, and all their soul. And he said that is equal to that was to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And he said that was the teachings of the prophets. That theme with the prodigal son, with the father, and the family of God, and the children of God, seems to be what Christ was teaching. And that's a beautiful thing. It's something that's revolutionary then, and it's revolutionary now. Unlike the Christian nationalism, there's nothing nationalistic about Christ. He was not a white man. He was not a Republican or a Democrat. He was a street preacher, a poor street preacher, who who taught to love God, and that God loves you, and that you should love everyone else around you, and that was the top teaching, was this love. It was a love philosophy that he taught, and it's really a shame that this short, dark-skinned, little Jewish man, who was a street preacher, who changed the world, that what he's teaching has been so corrupted over the years, and so used to to support any type of agenda. Well, folks, that's all I have on the historic Jesus. I hope I haven't brought him down to earth too much. Um, and as I said, I think that it's a shame that the Jesus of the national movement, or the Jesus of a lot of political. Well, folks, that's all I've got for Jesus today. I hope I didn't bring him down to earth too much. I do find it a bit ironic that that a poor Jewish man who's about 5'4", 5'6", with dark complected, his skin being damaged by the sun, who wore the poorest of clothes, undyed clothes, who was a street preacher who stood and preached love God and love mankind, would be turned around to justify wars, to cause the death of millions, to be the source of persecution. I think that when it says in there, when Christ meets some of these people, it'll be like, you did not know me. And I can definitely understand why. But on an up note, if you do enjoy these videos, then please, go down and go down and hit my King Henry head here, and give me a like, and leave me a comment. So as long as it's respectful. It's not respectful, it'll be going away. But it's good to be back. I know I've been gone for a while, and I apologize to all of my fans out there. Just I've been through a lot of transition lately, and I thought it was best to get that out of the way before I came back to this. But I'm back now, and hopefully I'll be seeing you soon. And until I do, remember my number one law, and that is stay pretty.